All right, we are joined here today by Dr. Twigs Way, uh, expert on garden gnomes. So thank you for joining us today. I was wondering if you could start by telling us how you got into researching garden gnomes in the first place and garden history. I'm fascinated by sort of academic research starting points. So what was the impetus for you in getting interested in this in the first place?
So, first of all, thank you ever so much for having me on, which is absolutely wonderful. My impetus for garden history and my impetus for garden gnomes are kind of different. So, I drifted into garden history because I was an archaeologist, and then I specialized in landscape, and I specialized a bit further down the line in the way in which the way we create landscape tells us about people and culture and context and ideologies and meaning, like everything else in archaeology. So that was me in landscape. And then that drifted into gardens and garden history. And that is really revealing. People's gardens, what they think about them is fascinating. So garden gnomes, well, that's slightly different because I had done a series of small books for a publisher called Shire, and they were on things like tea gardens and allotments and little kind of niche subjects in garden history. And they asked me what I'd like to do my next one on, and I didn't really know. So I went to the Garden Museum down in London and asked a friend of mine who works there and said, "What do you get asked for a book on that you don't have a book on?" You know, and he said garden gnomes. So I took a really deep breath because I have to say, garden gnomes were not what I envisaged myself writing about, even a small book. And I just thought, well, garden gnomes, they're going to be the same as anything else in garden history and anything else in culture and indeed in archaeology, because we create them, we use them, we put them around the place, they mean things to us, we can explore them from a cultural kind of context. So that was me. And I then became, unbeknownst to myself, what was going to happen. I ended up a bit of a kind of garden gnome queen, in that I'm people's go-to now. Whenever anything happens in the garden gnome world, whether Chelsea, RHS Chelsea lets in garden gnomes or keeps out garden gnomes, or Disney releases Romeo and Juliet, people ring me up and say, "Hey, what do you think about this from the standpoint of garden gnomes?" So here we are again on a podcast about garden gnomes. What is endlessly fascinating is that people ask completely different kind of questions, and also that they are endlessly fascinated by garden gnomes. So I often say garden gnomes have the last laugh on us because they just seem to intrigue us all the time.
Yeah, why do you think that the garden gnomes aspect of your research, why do you think people got so interested in that? Why do you think people are fascinated in garden gnomes in the way that they are?
Because I think because they're quite divisive, and they have various fashions and histories, so that you've got a little bit of history about them. Well, quite a lot of history if you look back on them, but most people only really know their history back into the very most, the beginning of the 20th century. Um, and then also, particularly in England, and I don't know how much in America, but certainly in other parts of Europe, Northern Europe especially, people remember them. They remember them from their grandparents' garden. Now, don't forget that grandparents are now great great grandparents, or you yourselves now grandparents. But people remember them. They're kind of associated with, oh, my grandparents had one of those in the garden, and so they're really interested in them. And also, they have these waves of fashion. So one year you'll go into a garden centre and find rows and rows and rows of gnomes, all painted green and looking vaguely like leprechauns, which is a kind of a bit peculiar. And then 2 years later, garden gnomes will have dropped out of fashion again. And they seem to be able to have all of these multiple revivals. And that kind of draws people in, it fascinates them.
Yeah, garden gnomes seem to have gone through these sort of different peaks and valleys, depending on, what country they're in, what time period
All the
it's in.
time, all the time. Yeah. And
And
they're fascinating for that. Without even knowing the background history to them, people can become fascinated in them. In the same way that people can say things like, I really don't like garden gnomes. And then they'll go, oh, except one that my grandmother had that was really nice and had little pink cheeks and a funny little hat, you know. And so they're quite personalized sometimes. And I think that's a way in for some people
mhm.
through, dare I say it, a personal relationship with a garden gnome. You know, they just do. And that makes them fascinating. Also, they can't quite believe that they are in fact, most people can't quite believe they are a serious subject within garden history. I mean, if I told you I was researching Roman statuary in gardens or fountains in gardens or, you know, a multitude of other things in gardens, everybody go, oh, yeah, that's fine. And when you say garden gnomes as a subject, they all kind of go, oh, that's a bit kind of flippant, really. So, yeah,
Well, that's what you learn, I think, is that anything can be studied from a critical lens. And sometimes
absolutely.
even those things that might seem trivial are actually where gold mines of cultural information can come from, can be mined from, to use
Yeah, yeah. To
a,
use a
a
dwarf
gnome.
stroke gnome, a
Exactly.
very relevant phrase. Um, yeah, and actually, I know so much more about them now than I did when I wrote the fairly small little book that I wrote for Shire. Shire books are always quite small;
I
they're
guess we
little
should, yeah, I
handbills.
have that right here for us. So yes,
It
guard gnomes.
used to have a far more interesting cover to it. It used to have an old book, an old picture
I've seen the
of
old
somebody.
cover too,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was really great. I'm not keen on one, but anyway, yeah. So I know so much more. So now I need to write a larger book on the history and culture of the garden gnome. So
Yeah, we need that larger book.
you do, yeah.
But I do want to dig into this sort of history that you're hinting at, prior to the 20th century, especially, because I think it's good for us to pick apart this connection with dwarves and the development of gnomes as a thing in the first place. So a question that I
Oh, yeah,
have,
you're going to need so much time if you want to pick that apart. That is one
yeah,
of the things when I give a talk, I kind of go, so we're just not going to really grapple with the whole dwarf gnome thing. We're just going to go with, you know, using both terms because it
sure.
is so difficult.
Well, I'll be specific with the question then, because at least based on my understanding and the research that I've done, this the concept of the gnome is really a Paracelsian thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. The
And
concept, the word
the
gnome.
word gnome.
Yeah, and in fact, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, so Erasmus Darwin, uses the term gnome as well in a poem
Okay.
about natural history. And so the word gnome, we know where the word gnome kind of comes from, and the association with gnomes and particularly underground. The glitch, if I can call it that, comes because the what you will call the kind of communal garden gnome, the one we're all used to, the small figure in the garden, that is really born from the area of Central Europe where they are associated with a little folk that are working down the mines, and they are dwarves, Zwergen. So they are very firmly called dwarves, and the dwarves are associated with, as I say, with mining and the tradition of mining and the tradition of being, as indeed most little folk are around Europe and indeed around the world, both helpful and good luck and also a hindrance. So it's like everywhere in Europe tends to have its own little folk, whether it's fairies, whether it's leprechauns, whether it's tomt, whether it's niece, and they tend to work on the farm or, you know, live on the edges of your eyesight, around the countryside, near human habitations, doing things that are both helpful, like, I don't know, milking the cows, or unhelpful, like stealing the cows after they've milked them. So they have this kind of duality and they live on the edges of human society. So that gets us back to dwarfs, stroke gnomes, who in Central Europe have this kind of folkloric status of being a little folk associated with mining. And they were both lucky. If you heard the clink of the dwarfs down the mines, then that was going to be a lucky seam, a lucky way to go. But also they were a bit scary because it might kind of be a premonition of a disaster to come. So, like most little folk, they work both ways. So the problem is that those are very definitely called dwarfs, whereas in other parts of Europe, we associate that kind of underground and volcanic kind of thing with the word gnome or gnome. So basically, and this is why I try and fudge it, most gnomes, particularly in the 19th, early 20th century, manufactured in Central Europe and come over here. And as soon as they get to what I call passport control, they get renamed as a gnome. And that's really it. That really, and you will see them in catalogues in what was then Bavaria, the sort of heartland of the dwarf manufacturing. And you will see them actually in the catalogues described as Zwergen, described as dwarves. And when they arrive in England, they are sold as gnomes.
Yeah, so it was Gartenzorgen, right? I don't
Yeah.
speak German, but that was what they were originally called. And
Well, yeah, I don't
we have
speak
this
German either. And I
starting in Germany.
really kind of upset everybody in the University of Cambridge manuscripts room, where it is very, very, actually, it was the rare books room, where it's very, very quiet. Because one day I actually found a reference in a German catalogue to Nomen. And I kind of went, this fun. And all these people looked up from their rare books and went, shh. So that was fun.
Yeah, disrupting the rare books
I did disrupt the
room.
rare
Yeah,
books. Yeah, shouting out dwarf in German. Not many
that
people
that's
know.
understandable. But so I'm interested in this association with just going back to this sort of development with Paracelsus of the gnome, of them being associated with the element of earth, because he was also
Yes,
using the term gnome alongside sylphs and undines, other elemental. So it really is an elemental figure at
it
its.
is an elemental figure originally in myth, but I think in a way that's to try and um, go back to and match the garden gnome to something. It's almost I don't mean this wrong, but there's almost a desperation, particularly in academics, to kind of match it to something classical, or at the very least Renaissance.
Mm,
And we just can't hack the fact that, to be honest, small, highly coloured little folk figures are dotted around gardens from the Roman period onwards, usually
right.
doing extremely reprehensible things with water. You know, so and in various states of undress. I have an amazing slide that I show, well, not slide nowadays, keynote, of a little Roman figurine which looks exactly like a gnome, exactly. I mean, it is, our word for a gnome. I'm not going back to Paracelsus here. In bronze, it's got the beard, it's got the pointy hat, it's dressed just like a gnome. It's about 3 foot tall or something. It would have, no, sorry, about that one's probably about 20 centimeters tall. Would have been put in a garden as a sort of, small household god. When you lift off the hat, let us just say you get a surprise, which
Yeah.
those of you that know a lot about what the Romans are really, very kind of prone to putting on their lamps and hanging around the place,
We know where that
you
water's.
know where that's going. So, I mean, naughty gnomes have nothing on that. Modern naughty gnomes, you do not lift off the hat and get a complete kind of, genitalia displayed to you, or at least not normally, not the ones they sell in garden centers. So, and I think what we're trying to do when we go back to things like Paracelsus and the kind of actually thinking about the term gnome we kind of missing the fact that small carved and pottery, ceramic, or indeed even bronze figures we used in gardens since the Roman period, and that and folklore probably have a lot more to do with the use of a garden gnome or dwarf than anything of the sort of that more Renaissance learned elemental thing does.
Yeah, and I've seen people point out, I can't remember if this is from your book or if I read it elsewhere, but Priapus statues in ancient Rome and Bacchus statues as being sort
Yeah,
of maybe sort of
exactly. That's
precursors to
exactly that.
these.
I hadn't found that particular one that you lift the hat off at the time I wrote the book. I only wish, though they probably wouldn't have let me put it in. It really is pretty obscene. Um, but yeah, little statues. So the Lares and Penates, the household gods and goddesses that were dotted around household shrines and garden shrines in Rome, you know, so you bring that idea of the small figurine, the small god, or minor god, and the idea of folklore together. And what do you get? You get people wanting a small figurine to put in a garden that represents some kind of, local folkloric belief or good
And
luck, which
it's
is what
fertility too, right? Yeah.
yeah,
It's
which is what they were when they were originally, particularly around the area. I always fudge this kind of area because it's changed names and political whatever so much, but that sort of the area that is was around Bavaria at the times when gnomes were particular, rather dwarfs were particularly being made. So that's just I think that's the real crux of it. It's that crossover between the good luck charm, the small figurine, the garden ornament, and folklore.
Yeah, and it's funny that there's been, pushback against sort of the obscene garden gnomes, but it's like that was kind of there from the beginning, or well, at least there was
Oh
associations
yeah,
going
yeah,
back
great
millennia.
associations. I mean, not so much the ones, as I say, once we start getting
The
that
80s.
association with Central Europe, you don't get the naughty gnome as we call them then. But we do, yeah, we definitely get them. And the painted, that's the other thing, because people kind of think um that because they're highly painted, that they're a very, very modern thing. But of course, we forget that most Roman statues were highly painted as well. So this idea that they're slightly gaudy is slightly inappropriate for a tasteful garden. And what you want is actually something in alabaster or, white stonework. Again, for your white stonework, Romans or indeed 18th century or the Renaissance, they would have rushed up to it with a paintbrush and kind of painted on and gilded on all sorts of colors to produce a garden gnome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want us to dig in a little bit into um the development, or at least the movement from Central Europe into England.
Yeah,
And
from
so
the kind of Thuringia area
you
it
s-
is. So,
okay.
yeah.
So we've hinted at sort of, I think, placing this in Germany and these specific aspects of it. But can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about how the garden gnome got to England, and specifically some of these characters, especially Sir Charles Isham, who kind of brought the popularity of
Wonderful
garden
Sir
gnomes
Giles
in the UK.
Isham. Yeah. So it's Charles Isham, who is credited with being the first person to put what we will now call gnomes, because they were in England, though some of his started off in Germany being a dwarf, but they got to be England, so they got to be garden gnomes. So he was the first person really that we know of to put small figurines on a rockery. So most people, up until the last 30 or 40 years, would probably think that the proper place for a small figurine was on a rockery, because it's associated with rocks, they're associated with mining, and also actually it makes your rockery look bigger because your garden gnomes are small. So, and that was an important point actually when you get them on the large rockeries. So, but Sir Charles Isham, who was an eccentric, and that is slightly unfortunate when you're talking about the history of gnomes, because you're already talking about a topic that is guaranteed to bring a slight smile and smirk to people's faces. And then you introduce Sir Charles Isham, who was for one of the upper class or aristocratic people in England slightly unusual. So he was a second son. He wasn't expecting, we're talking the mid 19th century, he wasn't really expecting to inherit the family estate, but he did end up doing so. He was a teetotal, anti-hunting, pro-workers' rights, latterly a vegan, and believed in mesmerism and spiritualism. To such an extent, he was actually, I can't remember if it was actually, technically, he was the chair, or he served on the council of the British National Association of Spiritualists. He believed in mesmerism. He corresponded with mesmerists. And at one point, he was corresponding with someone who said that they were currently on Jupiter and would send him a flower from there if it survived the post, which is a bit kind of weird. Anyway, so it is slightly unfortunate for those of us who are trying to take garden gnomes really seriously as an area of study, that he was one of the first people to put them on a rockery. But he was also, in amongst all of the other things he was a really admired, revered, and skilled grower of alpine plants. Now, alpine plants were really popular in the mid to late 19th century in England. And he built a rockery to put his alpine plants on, as you did. Now, don't think small suburban garden rockery. This rockery, which still exists actually, is probably about 30 foot tall by about 60 foot long, something like that. And it was by no means one of the larger rockeries for the upper classes in this period. They literally covered acres, some of them. The ones that Frank Crisp had, who was a fellow believer in spiritualism, actually, and a fellow alpine plant specialist. That one was actually modeled on the lower slopes of the Matterhorn, and indeed was painted in white at the top to echo the snows on the Matterhorn, and people would go off kind of into this Matterhorn landscape. So Frank Crisp, by the way, also had gnomes. But it was really Sir Charles Isham, and he collected together, first of all, small porcelain figures that had actually been used in the past for things like holding dinner cards on a table. You know, when you go to one of these posh dinner parties and you're meant to be sat in a particular place and you've got a little dinner card. So a place card. And place card holders, matchbox holders, that kind of thing, small porcelain figures, again, highly painted. Most of those actually either Crown Derby or coming over from Europe. And he put those on the rockery as little people. But then he started to import from Germany the dwarves that were being made in this area of Thuringia as a kind of folkloric good luck symbol of the area. So he started to import these very expensive, made in terracotta, hand painted, and he started to put those around. And in the end, he had literally, I think over 100. He wrote about them. He said that they represented real dwarfs, and he actually really believed that dwarfs existed, as in little folk, folkloric folk. This is where political correctness and everything all goes a little haywire, I'm afraid. When I'm talking about dwarfs, I am almost always, when discussing the history of gnomes, I'm talking about, dwarfs as little folkloric, mythical figures. And so he put those on there. And he wrote about them, and they were featured in things like Country Life as well, one of the more upmarket magazines of the period, periodicals of the period, and indeed in the Gardener's Chronicle. So that was Charles Isham. At the same time, other people from the aristocracy, or certainly the upper classes, were importing gnomes from Germany, because there was people would go to the Black Forest and various other Central European areas on holiday. They would want a souvenir. They would come back with these gnomes, and they would put them on the lawn, around the ponds, in their very aristocratic houses. And that brings us up.
I was going to say that brings us up uh towards at least the turn of the 20th century, right? Because
Yeah.
Sir Charles Isham was 1840s, correct? If I'm remembering correctly,
Yeah,
or
but he goes really his kind of domination of the gnome world, so to speak, in England. We're looking through the kind of up through 1870s. 1898, Country Life was describing his rockery. By then, you've got Sir Frank Crisp importing the large gnomes. They're the really tall, 3 foot tall ones. Sir Frank Crisp, who at Friar Park, also, as I mentioned, an alpine plant collector with massive, massive rockery. We don't know if he put his 3 foot tall gnomes on the rockery or whether they were kept separately, but that is the place that is later owned by George Harrison, the Beatle.
right? Yeah,
Um, and so his gnomes, for Frank Crisp gnomes, actually feature on the cover of one of Sir George Harrison's albums. And indeed, George Harrison also has lyrics that refer back to Frank Crisp. So they're not his gnomes. You have to go to David Bowie for a song about gnomes.
and it's All Things Must Pass, correct? The
Yeah, all
George
things must
Harrison,
pass. And I've
and
actually chatted to the guy who took the photograph of that.
really,
Yeah, when I was doing the book, talk about no leaf left unturned for such a small little book.
and
And he said of all the photographs he gets asked about, that's the one he gets most asked about.
oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And by that point, at least, I think George Harrison was fashioning himself in a way of sort of picturing this sort of intellectual that has connected with nature and is sort of
Yeah.
connecting with this sort of almost mythical past as well.
Yeah. Seeing the color that the gnomes are on the cover, I'm not sure how much that comes through with that, or whether he just
Hmm.
sees them as slightly quirky. Um, but he does. There's a lovely lyric when he's talking, not particularly about gnomes, but about Frank Crisp, and he says, "You know his faults. Now let his foibles pass. Life is one long enigma, my friend. So read on, read on." Answers at the end, which people take to be about different people actually, but it's most likely because of the reference at the beginning to "scan not a friend with a microscopic glass," is probably to do with Sir Frank Crisp for various reasons.
Hmm.
So who had naturalist interests. So
Sure.
yeah, he was really influenced by that. And so you have that lovely story. But then you have the complete crash of the gnomes.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about these sort of, again, these peaks and valleys that the gnomes went
Yeah.
through in the 20th century, because obviously this connection with Germany is going to
Yeah.
become
It's all going to end
very
unhappily for a while.
problematic in England.
So, well, indeed, in large parts of Europe, because it's not just
Right.
England that have dwarfs. So gnomes. Yeah, so lots of connections between the aristocratic and upper classes and the business classes of England and Germany. There was lots of toing and froing. And then, as some of your listeners may know, quite a lot of close connections and close familial connections as well, of course, amongst the upper classes. A lot of ours connected into Germany. But 1914 comes along. So, and everything that happens then. So, one of the things that does happen, first of all, a complete closing off. So, well, after the first year or so, a complete closing off of all of this kind of toing and froing with Germany and these connections with Germany. Anything German, not good. So you can't import these dwarfs. You won't be visiting Germany. Also, they're looked on as, not great. It's the same way that Japanese gardens were destroyed in England during the Second World War. All of the Japanese gardens were destroyed, all the Japanese tea gardens,
Mm.
burnt, destroyed, thrown into ponds, all the rest of it. So But also what happens is, and this I found totally fascinating. I only found 2 photographs of this, but I found it totally fascinating. In the same way that English soldiers were actually often sent for recuperation, rest, or indeed even training to aristocratic houses, large country houses with large grounds, the German soldiery appears also sometimes to have been based at the equivalent in Germany. And there you get photographs of them holding what they would have thought of as garden dwarfs. And there are photographs of German soldiers gathered round, for a group photograph, each of them holding a dwarf. And sometimes with what appear to be nurses as well, so it must be convalescing at the equivalent aristocratic house, which had these large dwarfs in. So this association with Germany means that by the 1920s or so, dwarves have really become unpopular, and they're not being much imported. There is a slow trickle back. The complete change really happens associated with the Second World War, in fact, because towards the end of that, I mean, it's earlier in America, but in England, you start to get the importation from China, literally on a slow boat from China, of concrete gnomes. Not so beautifully styled, not so carefully done, just molded, lead molds of concrete, basically, come over on a slow boat from China. And at the same time, you get the release in England at the end of the Second World War. It's practically the first thing people go and see again, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Disney. And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Disney, you probably never had a really good look at the faces of those 7 dwarfs. And by the way, they are Snow White and the 7 dwarfs.
Dwarves.
And
Yeah.
you can buy a set, you still can, of Snow White and the 7 dwarfs as for your garden gnomes, but they're still called Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, even though they're garden gnomes. Right.
Hmm.
So you
Hmm.
could get the whole set. But that means that suddenly, instead of looking like the traditional garden gnome with the long, and you're about to look at that book, but that's actually a 1970s gnome. A traditional Bavarian gnome has a sort of longer, very detailed, ruffly beard. It wears a pair of Birkenstocks, basically. So it wears a pair of kind of Birkenstocks. It has a much more pointy hat. And it's quite it is a person, a miniaturized person, a miniaturized old man. But the Disney Snow White and 7 Dwarfs, as we all know, very cartoonish, very babyish faces. They're the first things you really see that encapsulate what is now a modern fashion for toys with huge, great eyes and a sort of babyish face. And those 7 dwarves with that very different style and the slouchy hats and the different colors and all the rest of it, they become enormously popular. And they're very cheap to buy, even if you buy all 7 plus Snow White. They're very cheap to buy. They're made in concrete and then later on in resin. They're painted in all sorts of different colors. And they do 2 things. They displace the traditional old man style garden gnome, but they also mean that, so they displace the old fashioned one, but they also herald in the sort of much poorer quality, cheaper, and therefore associated. This is where we get into class, which is such an English thing or a UK thing. They become associated with suburbia, with the working classes, with people that haven't got very much money. This is totally different to somebody that's gone over to Germany on a business outing and bought an incredibly expensive terracotta garden gnome hand painted and put it in their aristocratic estate. We're now talking about nipping down to Woolworths, buying the full set of seven dwarfs, for, I don't know, 15 shillings and sixpence, and installing them in your suburban garden. So we have dropped about 5 or 6 classes, just in one. So that is the social downfall. However, the popularity and the numbers shoot up. It's just a social downfall. I
Because
think the way
you
that
never thought that.
people after the Second World War, the way that the gnome embeds itself in the idea of holidays as well. Oh, and gnome napping, which of course is all about holidays. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, the idea that you've got this revival of the gnome, and actually they creep back in from Europe as well. You start to get the large 3 foot ones coming back in from Europe, but they become associated with fun and holidays, because I mean, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, what's not to like? I mean, people used to go and see the film endless. It was the first color film people had seen for a lot of people. Um, so this whole Disney thing really takes off, and but then you get rockeries full of gnomes on the sort of the outskirts of seaside resorts, and you get things like Gnome Land on the Isle of Wight, which is a really well-known kind of holiday destination, where there were loads of scenes with gnomes set up, around toadstools, or gnomes set up doing various things, little groups of gnomes, and you actually kind of walked through it, and it was Gnome Land. And again, when I was doing the book, I actually spoke to the guy whose grandfather had founded Gnome Land. And how successful it'd be. I mean, 3 generations, it was still going at that stage. I don't know if it is now. And he would actually replenish his gnomes at the end of every season, and he would get some in from Germany. And you could actually spot the ones from Germany, really high quality ones. But these are kind of scenarios. And at this stage, you start to get other things added in, like the stone tortoise, the windmill. I mean, the windmill's a complete mystery to me. Why the windmill? I have no idea why the windmill. I mean, it's not very kind of little folk mining German or whatever. And then also coming over as a strand from America, you get the flamingo appears. So
Very similar usage in parts of the United States,
yeah,
the flamingo to the gardenum. It's more of
flamingo.
kind of a tropical Florida,
Yeah.
California.
Somebody once sent me the whole kind of academic history of the flamingo as a garden feature.
And there's
Oh,
an entire hotel in Las Vegas
yeah, devoted to the flamingo.
devoted to
So
it.
the flamingo becomes associated as well. And, these unlikely things kind of tag on. So I remember when I was a small girl in the, early to mid 1960s, when I was quite young, and close to where my grandma lived on a council estate of bungalows. There were a couple of people with front gardens with piles of rocks, usually painted in white. There were usually bits of concrete with a windmill on top, and a selection of garden gnomes and a pond and fishing and all of this kind of thing, and a random flamingo and a windmill. And that is how they came to be perceived. And when we started to revisit them, so to speak, when they started to become popular again in the kind of 1990s, this was the thing that people remembered. They didn't know about the earlier history. So they remember the history of the kind of 1950s and 60s gnome, the suburban gnome, the brightly colored gnome, the not great, usually not great quality gnome.
And this is
And
where nostalgia comes in too.
the nostalgia gnome. And
Mhm.
of most of the people, when I go and give talks about gnomes, which is surprisingly popular and surprisingly often requested,
People
um,
yearn for the gnomes.
yeah, that's people at the end. They come up and they say, "Oh, when my grandma died, we found the gnome in the bottom of her garden, and I couldn't bear to part with it." Or, "I've secretly got a collection of garden gnomes that was handed down to me," or and it's always those ones. I mean, very occasionally I will have somebody come up that says, I think I've got an original Heisner gnome, or a gnome from Grafenrode. Um, one of the original Thuringia 19th century gnomes. And then I tell them, don't repaint it, don't wash it, put it inside, treasure it. And when you need some money, go to an auction house. But yeah, it's this nostalgia. And indeed, in the 90s, when you had the double whammy. Actually, it wasn't the 90s for Amelie, because I just went to see the film's 25th anniversary last week. So it must have been 2000s. Anyway, there is this kind of revival of kitsch and revival of nostalgia, what we might nowadays would call something like granny core. And you get gnomes being used in advertising. So the roaming gnome, Travelocity, and over here, Bowden name a gnome. Bowden's kind of middling class women's clothing company, and various things like that, playing on the nostalgia of the gnome, basically. And then
Yeah.
Amelie, of course, comes out, the film Amelie, and talks about a French film. Was it very popular in America?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. We're familiar with it as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
At
you.
least,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sometimes you never know. You're kind of going on about something that's just like really well known, and the other
Hmm.
person's looking kind
Hmm.
of, I've never heard of this. So yeah, and the gnome napping. So,
Yeah.
and
Talk about
gnome
that.
napping becomes quite a thing, both before and after Amelie. She didn't actually make it up, or they didn't actually make it up for the film. It was present before. The first case was Australia. But yeah, gnome napping becomes quite a thing as well. So, because of Amelie. So you then have that popularity going on.
Well,
So,
again, that's one of the going back to this idea of kind of triviality. I mean, the gnome is this entry point into all of these intersections of
yeah,
culture, of
yeah,
popular culture, of folk culture, of commodified culture,
yeah, absolutely.
of you know, intra-continental exchange, all of those things.
I know, it's just amazing. And you take this one thing that people think is just some kind of, light-hearted small figurine, and you can go anywhere from the Renaissance to the Roman period to folkloric myth to serious alpine gardening, through cultural exchange and war and peace and films and culture and cinema and class, and so much just from this one thing. I think if there was one thing I really learned from writing about garden gnomes, is there really isn't anything that you cannot take and kind of unpick its cultural significance.
Yeah, and that's the value of what I mean, garden history. If you would
History.
consider that history in general, material
Yeah.
culture is maybe what we would classify
That
it.
that yeah, material culture. I mean, when I was doing my original PhD, everything was about, understanding material culture,
Mhm.
and the significance of that. And it is a cultural, the garden gnome is a cultural artifact, just like everything else, and just like all cultural artifacts. We can explore so much through it.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think that's what we can learn from. I mean, you can learn about the garden gnome, but we can learn more about sort of
We learn about
this
us
critical.
through the
We learn
garden
about
gnome.
us
We learn
exactly.
about us and culture and fashions in culture. One of the most amazing things I think I've seen, because now garden gnomes are used a lot because they're kind of fairly cheap, cheerful, and you can get lots of them together. And they're used for various art installations to make ironic or whatever comments about culture, about modern world. There was one done by, I think it was a Bavarian artist actually, had literally thousands of gnomes all doing a Nazi salute, painted black
Mm,
and installed
mm.
in a massive kind of, I think it was like the equivalent of a football ground, you know. And so you get comments like that. They're used in art now quite a lot, and they can make really good cultural and political commentaries. because of their history and because of that interaction. But on
Yeah,
the other
well, it's
hand, you can
fascinating.
just go down a garden centre and buy one with a little pointy hat that's laughing at
That's
you.
what I did. That's what I did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what does that say about us or about you or about anything? I mean, it's fascinating. They are fascinating, like anything else.
Great. Well, I think that's a great stopping point for
Yeah,
us.
I think so too. Yeah.
Again, Garden Gnomes by Twigs Way. Go get a copy of it. Is there anything else you would like to plug for us? The program that you're in or that you're overseeing, anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean, in my what you might call my real life,
Yes. Yeah, you realize.
my non-garden gnome life. Yeah, I am actually program director for the MA and PhD by research, MA in research and PhD in garden history at the University of Buckingham. We are at the moment largely a kind of face-to-face kind of um, program, but actually we are increasingly turning, as everybody is, to being able to deliver um, by virtual learning as well. So we're kind of
Mm,
doing a mashup at the moment. So that's kind of what I do in real life. But I have also written other books which largely take that kind of approach that I did with gardens. So I did a fascinating, again, a very small book for Shire on tea gardens, where you used to kind of cycle out to and have a cup of tea. Very, very English. But actually, behind that is the whole idea of how the English perceive themselves and kind of
mm,
nationhood, and also, again, cultural change, because the people going out to that were the working classes living in those large, new, suburbias and working in factories and having a weekend where they could get a bicycle and go out to tea gardens. That was great. And various other ones, including, I think it's A Nation of Gardeners, and then Women in the Garden, A History of Women in the Garden.
mm.
I say it's kind of,
Fascinating.
bookending literally my kind of publishing career, I suppose. I started off with Women in the Garden and ended up with Gnomes.
It's funny the twists and turns things take. I'll have to
Yeah.
look into the tea garden book. I tried to fasten my own version of it, but I live next to a busy road, so it's kind of
Oh, right. Yeah.
a
No, tea
machine in the
gardens.
garden situation. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Anyway,
Well, thank you very much for your
brilliant.
time. This has
Yeah. Well,
been
I'm going to
great
go off now and
and
watch a
fascinating.
solar eclipse because we have a solar eclipse
Oh,
here in an hour's time.
great. Okay. Well, enjoy
Well, it
that.
starts in an hour and then it's meant to be something like 95% eclipsed in
Wow,
at 7 o'clock. So I'm going to
that'll
go
be
and
fun.
find top of a hill and watch the sun go down,
Great.
and literally watch it be eclipsed while it goes down.
I love solar eclipse, so that'll be a fun experience.
The last one I saw actually was in San Diego back in, I think it was 1991.
Oh, really?
Yeah, complete solar eclipse.
Mm.
It was really freaky. We just happened to be on the, in that area. And
San Diego's great. I love San Diego.
yeah, and there we are. There was a solar eclipse. Everybody was incredibly excited. We just happened to be there. It was really long as well. Apparently, it was one of the longest solar eclipses. So this one's quite brief. Even it's going to be a full eclipse in Spain and Iceland, that kind of arc. It's going to be 100% eclipsed, but only for a couple of minutes. But here we're going to get about 95% eclipse. So should be worth seeing, though.
Well,
Not
that'll
something you
be
see every
fun.
day.
Enjoy the solar eclipse.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was really nice doing it, actually. Yeah, really fun. Really, really fun. So let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do tea gardens next.
Ah, anything you like.
We'll
So
see. Okay, thank you
see
so
you.
much, Twigs. I
Bye.
appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.